This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 40 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is October 13th, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Let's jump into a quick recap because we actually have a two-parter episode today. We'll start off with continuing our historical timeline, and then we'll follow up by bringing on a good friend and fellow podcaster to discuss the My BoM podcast and how it wraps into the Kickstarter campaign that is currently active for one more week from the time that this is broadcast. The last historical timeline episode covered a small portion of time, yet a heaping portion of dissent and murmuring happening in the church at the end of 1837. That last historical episode began with Parker Pratt, or as we know him, P Cubed, raising up a stirring against Joe for selling him some land at a 2,600% inflation rate, which seemed to spur a lot of anger in the church leadership, understandably. After that, Joe headed to Painesville to board a steamer for Canada and was arrested multiple times. Now, we talked about this happening back in episode 38, but in episode 39, we spent the majority of the time covering the court documents for the one trial that was held that day against Joe. The lawsuit was filed against Joe by a man named Grandison Newell, who had filed nearly a dozen other lawsuits against the prophet by this time. This lawsuit, however, was different than any other that Joe had experienced prior to this point. Previous court hearings against Joe usually fell along the lines of him, like fucking over somebody on a business deal, or maybe calling a church leader into question for apostasy, or whatever the case may have been. But this lawsuit with Grandison Newell was different, because he claimed that Joe tried to have him killed by commanding that it be done by two men who were named Davis and Denton. This situation sets itself apart as a defining moment in Mormon history and Joe's leadership. Now, just in the abstract real quick, when somebody wants another person dead, like for example, a prophet wants a vicious anti-Mormon like Newell dead, there's a couple of ways to do it. The prophet can do the deed himself, or he can hire an assassin, or the scariest option, the prophet can command it to be done by divine revelation, as the will of God. Now, hiring an assassin is one thing, and killing somebody yourself is something related, yet a little bit different. But the most horrifying and sinister of those options to somebody being put out of the way is a prophet commanding that to be done, and then it being carried out. Once Joe crossed the threshold of commanding somebody to kill in the name of God, there's just no walking that shit horse back into the shit barn. And that's what Grandison Newell accused Joe of doing, giving directions from God for his followers, Davis and Denton, to go kill an anti-Mormon. That's a brand new level of mob boss shit that Joe accomplished. I mean, I made the argument in the episode that whether or not Joe actually ordered the assassination doesn't really matter when we examine the fact that rumors were circulating that he'd done so, and that Joe stood on trial against Grandison Newell concerning those rumors, that Joe told somebody to kill this guy. After we discussed this court trial and everything that happened there, we discussed an account given by Eliza Snow that claimed Warren Parrish teamed up with some other apostates to try and take over the congregation with pistols and bowie knives. This was after Joe and friends had left for Missouri, so it's no wonder the mice were playing whilst the cat was tending to rats in other places. So that's pretty much it for the last episode. Now let's just jump into the meat of this episode with a discussion about church affairs in late September of 1837. On September 27th, Joe and friends left Kirtland for Far West to try and rein in the Whitmers and W.W. Phelps, or as we know him, Double Dub, and those other church leaders that were out in Missouri. They were out there running the church contrary to the wishes of Joe and Rigdon at HQ, headquarters in Kirtland. And Joe and Rigdon decided to answer the problems by attending to the issues in person, as opposed to letter exchanges that have been sufficing to fix the problem up to this point. But as stated in the last historical episode, as soon as Joe set foot outside of Kirtland, the church imploded on itself. And once trusted leaders in the church were viciously opposed to the absentee rule of Joseph the prophet. This is a small extract from a letter exchange between John and Clarissa Smith to George A. Smith, who was Joe's cousin. It's dated January 1st, 1838. Just barely breaching into that 1838 timeline. We're not going to close up 1837 quite yet, but that'll be done by the end of this episode. But this is dated January 1st, 1838, taken from the LDS Personal Archives. And it is reprinted in Marquardt's The Rise of Mormon, from where I'm extracting this passage. Quote, "The spiritual condition at this time is gloomy also. I called the High Council together last week and laid before them the case of a company of dissenters. 28 persons were upon, after mature discussion, proceeded to cut them off from the church. The leaders were Cyrus Smalling, Joseph Coe, Martin Harris, Luke Johnson, John Boynton, and Warren Parrish. We have cut off between 40 and 50 from the church since you left." End quote. Those were some big names in the leadership of the church, and it tacked another 40 to 50 people on at the end of it that had been cut off from the church. Wow. Now that letter was sent on the first day of January 1838. We missed a little bit. So let's cover our timeline from the end of September, when Joe and friends left for Missouri, to January of 1838. To offer a little bit of context for what we just read out of that letter. Once Joe, Rigdon, and Ollie left for Far West, there were very few people living in Kirtland that were trusted to not overthrow the church. The loyal followers of Joe were the minority in leadership positions at this point. It is worth pointing out that the average everyday follower of the church wasn't aware of most of the insurrection that was happening up in the higher echelons. They were just living their own lives and going to church on Sundays as they were instructed by the prophet. The typical member of the church may be experiencing hard times from the general economy that was beginning an arduous depression, but the majority of people that had lost money with the collapse of the Kirtland Safety Society Company were leaders in the church, many of which who understandably held a grudge against the prophet for fucking them with the rag money that he was responsible for creating and circulating. The majority of the typical members of the church were aware of things that were going on, but weren't quite as directly affected by it as, say, P Cubed, Parley P. Pratt, who'd been robbed by Joe with these 3 plots of land that were sold at the 2,600% rate of inflation. The average member didn't experience that. They'd only heard about things like that going on from other members of the church, from rumors that were circulating. And while the leadership of the church was amidst schism, many of the followers of Joe were still faithful to his rule, having no real reason to question his authority. Many social or political movements in the past have been waged by vocal minorities against a less vocal or even a silent majority. The temperance movement, for example. A very small minority was able to pass a constitutional amendment banning alcohol. The abolitionist movement. Very few people in the South wanted slavery to be outlawed, but once a few people in the North were vocal enough about it, those anti-slavery Southerners were happy to jump on the bandwagon against the less vocal slave-owning majority. Even declaring independence in the first place was a minority movement that was spearheaded by a vocal subsect of politicians that we now call the Founding Fathers. Regardless of the example offered, the principle still holds. When somebody wants change, it requires a loud minority to bring about that change, even if the majority is silently enjoying things the way they are. Unfortunately, most of what we read from trusted historical sources during this 1837 and 38 time is quite biased because these people were the most affected and they were the vocal minority of displeased leaders or members in the church. People don't often write good reviews if they have a good experience, but they're sure happy to write a bad review if they're mad or if they had a bad experience. And that's what we see in the historical record. A lot of people were furious with the prophet and his leadership, a fury which makes its way through the 180 years to inform us of the general opinion at the time. Let's read a chunk from the history of the church. As we know, the history of the church began being dictated by Joe sometime in the beginning of 1838 and was published starting in 1842 in the Times and Seasons and the Millennial Star. This is the sanitized version of what was going on in the church. This is the most faith-promoting version of church history published by the church itself. After that, we'll read about this time from another source to point out the stark contrast between the two narratives. This is directly from the history of the church during the time Joe, Rigdon, Ollie, and other friends were headed out to Far West. This is in Volume 2, starting with page 518. Quote, "About this time, Elder Parley P. Pratt, P-cubed, was laboring in New York, publishing his Voice of Warning, consisting of 216 pages. We talked about that last episode, I believe. I started from Kirtland on the 27th of September, in company with Brother Sidney Rigdon, to fulfill the mission appointed to us on the 18th of September by a conference of elders, in establishing places of gathering for the saints." Now, establishing places of gathering for the saints? That's alluding to the second mass exodus. We'll talk about that soon. Brothers William Smith and Vincent Knight accompanying us. October 1st, Elder Lyman Sherman was elected High Counselor at Kirtland in place of Jared Carter, removed to Far West. Lyman Sherman is a very fascinating name. We're going to have to keep him in mind up until, probably next episode. We'll discuss what he did in next episode. He's just an amazing guy. Continues on. October 2nd, Samuel H. Smith was elected president of the High Council, and council voted that if a counselor absented himself from their meetings without a reasonable excuse, he should be reported to the church as a delinquent. The High Council at Kirtland voted that the clerk grant licenses to the members of the council who wished to travel, signed by the president and clerk. We arrived at Terre Haute, Indiana on the 12th, about midway from Kirtland to Far West. That's October 12th. My brother Hiram's wife, now this is sad and fucked up, Jerusha Barden Smith, this is Hiram's wife, died on the 13th of October while I was at Terre Haute and her husband at Far West. She left 5 small children and numerous relatives to mourn her loss. Her demise was severely felt by all. Ugh, that's terrible, isn't it? Her, Hiram Smith's wife died here 1837. She said to one of her tender offspring while on her dying bed, so we're somehow getting her final words through this, quote, "Tell your father when he comes that the Lord has taken your mother home and left you for him to take care of." End quote. That's it. That's all we get. The Lord has taken me home and left you to take care of. That's not a very good deathbed goodbye to a small child that's watching their mother die. That's horrible. But it finishes out that passage. She died in full assurance of a part in the first resurrection. So she had her second anointing, apparently. October 15th, the high priest's quorum at Kirtland decided to take Dr. Samson of Vard's license until he returns and makes satisfaction, and the High Council concurred. So Dr. Samson of Vard was, against the church, so they took away his license. Now here we witness a culling of the weak. Listen to the verbiage that's used in this passage out of the history of the church, because it's very important, and it very thinly veils what was actually happening. October 18th, the High Council and presidents of the different quorums met in the Lord's house, Samuel H. Smith presiding, and after a lengthy discussion concerning existing evils, agreed that it was time to commence the work of reform, and voted unanimously to meet again in the Lord's house on Monday evening next, and invite the different quorums to meet at the same time, and commence pruning the vine of God in Kirtland, and thus continue the work evening after evening until it shall be wisdom to stay their hands. And that was recorded by Phineas Richards, clerk of the High Council, who was Willard Richards' brother, cousin to Brigham Young. Willard Richards was the guy, the only man present during the Carthage shootout that was not shot. Sunday the 22nd, it continues, the church in Kirtland disfellowshipped 22 brethren and sisters until they make satisfaction for uniting the world in a dance the Thursday previous. End quote. That's them pruning the vine of God, or as I would say it, culling the weak. So after that, after the passage, that culling of the weak passage, they chastised John Johnson Jr. for selling spirituous liquors to those who were in the habit of getting intoxicated. That's a direct quote out of there. They had to chastise this guy because he was selling liquor to people. And the next passage deals with people that were running this underground liquor market that was going on in Kirtland. October 29th. 9 more of the brethren and sisters were reported to the church as having been engaged in the recreations of the 19th instant, and 11 of the 31 that had been reported made confession. So they're culling, 9 more people out of that, and 11 of the 31 people that were culled out before made confession and, were re-engaged in the church. Then it goes on in the history of the church. On the 30th of October, brothers Norris, Brewster, and others presented to the High Council a plan for better organization of the church in temporal affairs. Better organization? That sounds like a schism. Stating that Moroni had appeared to Collins Brewster. The council decided that it was a trick of the devil. Most of those who were complained of for participating in the recreation of the 19th and had not confessed acknowledged their faults to the High Council on the 1st of November, and the remainder were required so to do or be cut off from the church. This sounds like it's approaching chaos to me. They can't rein in the underground liquor that's bought and sold in Kirtland. They can't get people to confess of their wrongdoings. The leadership disfellowed 22 people in a week and another 31 in the following weeks for being opposed to the High Council. And all of this was going on while the prophet, Ollie, Hiram, and Rigdon were traveling from Ohio to Missouri and back. Remarkable. So let's just shift our focus from the affairs in Kirtland and discuss what happened when Joe and friends arrived in Far West Missouri, because we're looking at 2 separate settings. We have the turmoil and strife happening in Kirtland, and that's what we're discussing here. And then we have what's going on in Far West, which is turmoil and strife as well. But that's where Rigdon and Joe, the prophet, were headed to rein in the problems there, to take care of those problems in person. So the history of the church continues talking about Far West. Quote, I arrived at Far West sometime in the latter part of October or 1st of November. A meeting of some of the church was called in the 6th to counsel on certain affairs of the church, which I attended with brothers Rigdon and Hiram Smith. There were present also elders Thomas B. Marsh, a douche, William McClellan, that's Professor Bill, Leadfoot Lyman Johnson, William Smith Crazy Willie, and Vincent Knight from Ohio. The High Council of the Church of Far West, and some other elders. Prayer offered by William Wines Phelps. Double dub. End quote. So this meeting here that happened in Far West as soon as Joe and Rigdon arrived was really important. The Far West Church was running off the rails at this point, and Joe and Rigdon needed to set things back in order. So this meeting on November 7th was crucial in the preservation of the church and Joe as the head prophet of said church. During this meeting, a vote was held to sustain Joe as president of the church to preside over the church, while President Sidney Rigdon was called as his first counselor. The votes were unanimously passed. That's what it says in the history of the church. It should be taken with a grain of salt. But when Joe tried to get Frederick G. Williams, or as we know him, Freddie Willie, to be second counselor, a bunch of people stood up and objected to the vote. We had General Lyman White was the first to object to the nomination of Freddie Willie because he saw some information in a letter that was written by Freddie Willie that could be considered heretical, making Freddie unfit to lead. Then after that, Thomas Marsh, James Emmett, Thomas Grover, and some others all objected to Freddie Willie being second counselor. So, in reaction to that, Hinge-Pin Rigdon stood up during this discussion and said, "I nominate Hiram Smith to be second counselor." And it was carried out with a unanimous vote in the affirmative. So there it was. In Far West, it was set out. Joseph Smith was prophet. Hinge-Pin Sidney Rigdon was first counselor. Hiram Smith, second counselor. Ollie Cowdung, of course, at this time was a clerk, a secretary, basically. I mean, a culling of the week was going on back in Kirtland. So it's only fitting to have a similar culling happening in Far West. And that's what happened. At this time, the Whitmers and Phelps were somewhat opposed to the church, but they must have had a good talking to because they were placed back in leadership positions operating underneath Ollie Cowdung, who was head clerk, who was pretty much Joe's eyes and ears once he went back to Kirtland. And that was initially Ollie's reason for moving out to Far West permanently. The entire church structure in Far West was completely reorganized, with the most trusted individuals being placed at the top, with somewhat less trusted people serving underneath those people. The council minutes end with something quite fascinating that will serve to drive a massive wedge between Joe and Ollie. It says, quote, "Adjourned until early candlelight, and met accordingly, when remarks were made by many of the authorities present upon the previous disposition of the town plat, the purchase of land, etc., and all difficulties were satisfactorily settled, except a matter between Oliver Cowdery, Thomas B. Marsh, and myself, which was referred to us with the agreement that our settlement of the affair would be sufficient for the council." End quote. Now, I'm not going to try and tease you with that, this affair that they're talking about. What was this affair that Oliver Cowdery, Thomas B. Marsh, and Joseph were in disagreement about? I can't tease you with it because it's very simple. It was the Fanny Alger affair, the affair that was actually an affair. In April of 1838, which is a few months after what we're talking about right now, Ollie wrote a letter to his brother talking about this dirty, nasty, filthy affair, which is exactly the issue that Ollie and Darsh raised against Joe. And Joe was able to sweep it under the rug and settle it to a point that was, quote, "sufficient for the council," end quote, which meant they weren't throwing punches at each other anymore. It was all I can assume. Now, this is the wedge to which I'm referring. The Fanny Alger situation simply wouldn't die. We'd been following Joe around for nearly 2 years by this point, and Ollie still wasn't satisfied with Joe's bullshit justification that allowed him to be a pious prophet while still fucking that hot 19-year-old that lived in his house that one time. If we could point to one thing that drove Ollie away from the church, Fanny Alger was it. Obviously, Joe and Ollie had their differences, especially when it came to Rigdon's place in their three-way leadership triangle. And I would say that Ollie had dealt with Joe's shit for nearly a decade by this point, but at some point, Ollie couldn't take the shit anymore, and he did something about it. But we'll have to talk more on that in the coming historical timeline episodes. We can't get too far ahead of ourselves. So let's continue on through November of 1837 here. The High Council was organized in Far West, something that needed to be done in person by Joe and Rigdon to instate a level of presence within their leadership. And they could also talk to these people directly and see who was actually a supporter of Joe and who might be somewhat less trustworthy. Soon after this council was held, Joe and Rigdon headed right back to Kirtland. It was an 800-mile journey just for a couple hours worth of organization meetings, talking about the leadership and what they're going to do with the property in Far West. In the middle of November, somewhere between the 10th and the 15th, they left Far West to make their way back to Kirtland. All the while, the Kirtland church was amidst a meltdown. Chaos and pandemonium were gripping the saints in this headquarters of the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints. Last episode, we talked about Warren Parrish's armed uprising that was happening while Joe and Rigdon were on their way back to Kirtland. On December 10th, 1837, they arrived in Kirtland. So let's discuss what happened during their nearly month-long journey back to Ohio from Far West, Missouri. This next passage is from the council minutes at Kirtland on November 20th. This is what was going on as they were traveling from Far West back to Kirtland. This was more than half a month before Joe and Rigdon would arrive back at HQ, which happened on December 10th. So on November 20th, this is what the history of the church says, quote, Reuben Hedlock preferred the following charge against Zenos H. Brewster, Jane Brewster, Collins Brewster, D.H. Dustin and wife, Moses R. Norris and wife, Eliza Norris, Samuel Barnett, Jemima Butler, Osmond M. Dewell, blank Butler, their name is illegible, and Roxana Repshar for giving heed to revelations said to be translated from the Book of Moroni by Collins Brewster, and for entering into a written covenant different from the Articles and Covenants of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and following a vain and delusive spirit, end quote. The council heard arguments from the people listed, and they claimed that the current church had departed from its holy roots, and that they were following new revelations that were more in line with what the original church was. By the end of the council, every single person that I just now listed were disfellowshipped, and they were treated as apostates to the one true church of the Latter-day Saints. Now that Collins Brewster that was listed third in there, Collins Brewster, that was actually James Collins Brewster. He just went by Collins. And James C. Brewster was the founder of the Brewsterite sect of the Church of Christ. He claimed that he was the one true prophet, and that Joe had departed from being a prophet. And once Joe died in 1844, James Brewster began to amass a following and lead a group of Brewsterites to live in the New Mexico desert, which promptly collapsed in 1851. I mean, wow. This was a different religious sect than the Parrishites that followed Warren Parrish after he broke off of the church at this same exact time at the end of 1837. So we have the Parrishites, the Brewsterites, and then we have not-so-smarty Marty Harris teaming up with a couple guys named Cyrus Smalling and Joseph Coe to take back the church and found their Church of Christ and remove that whole Latter-day Saints bullshit that's tacked on at the end. Now, this is continuing on in the History of the Church, Volume 2. Quote, I returned to Kirtland on or about the 10th of December. Of course, whenever it says I in the History of the Church, that's talking about Joseph Smith. It's given from a first-person narrative, even though most of this is not actually first-person from him. During my absence in Missouri, Warren Parrish, John F. Boynton, Luke S. Johnson, Joseph Coe, and some others united together for the overthrow of the church. Soon after my return, this dissenting band openly and publicly renounced the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints and claimed themselves to be the old standard, calling themselves the Church of Christ, excluding the word saints, and set me at naught and the whole church, denouncing us as heretics, not considering that the saints shall possess the kingdom according to the prophet Daniel. End quote. The next passage I'm going to read is from the Geiga County Records, and I'm reading it from the Rise of Mormonism, page 442. Quote, State of Ohio, be it known that before me, Warren A. Cowdery, that's Oliver Cowdery's brother, a justice of the peace in and for the Kirtland Township in said county, personally appeared Joseph Coe, Martin Harris, and Cyrus Smalling, and took the following oath to wit. So Warren Cowdery, who was the justice of the peace at the time of Kirtland, said that Joseph Coe, Martin Harris, and Cyrus Smalling all appeared before him and took this oath that he's about to recount. This is the oath. You and each of you do swear in the presence of Almighty God that you will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Ohio, and will faithfully discharge your duties as trustees of the Church of Christ in Kirtland Township in said county to the best of your abilities. End quote. That oath was taken on January 18th, 1838. But the organization of this Harris/Co/Smalling Church of Christ was in the works since mid-November of 1837. This really is a remarkable time in our historical timeline. Think about this. Not So Smarty Marty was literally the third person to enter our historical timeline nearly 2 years ago. Go back and look at the episode list. Episode 1 is Joe. Episode 2 is an introduction to Emma Hale, who would become Emma Smith. And then in episode 3 is our introduction to Martin Harris. Not So Smarty Marty. He was with us before Ollie Cowdung was. Oliver Cowdery entered our timeline on episode 5. Not So Smarty Marty has been the pinnacle of hilarity and characterization of the absurdity of an early 19th century mindset for us to just laugh along with. I mean, Not So Smarty Marty was quoted with walking through the woods and talking with Jesus in the form of a deer for some number of miles. Not So Smarty Marty was the guy who took Joe's revelation on snake handling seriously during Zion's camp and was bit on the foot by a snake. Not So Smarty Marty was swindled by Joe because he dropped his toothpick and couldn't find it, but then Joe did his little magic trick with the rock in the hat and was able to find the toothpick. That was the first swindling that Joe had of Not So Smarty Marty. He is the perfect example of a typical credulous mindset that was repeatedly Joe's target since the day they met. And now, after a decade of working with Joe and 2 years in our historical timeline, Not So Smarty Marty was a heretic. And upon Joe's return to Kirtland in December, Marty was responsible for leading away the largest chunk of the congregation that any of these breakoff sects resulted in. More people followed Joseph Coe and Martin Harris than they followed Warren Parrish or the Brewsters or any of the other people that defected at this time. This was a monumental time during church history. And Not So Smarty Marty didn't just leave peaceably. He stood up during one of the congregations and stated something that is truly the most damning indictment against the Book of Mormon by one of the 3 witnesses, the bankroller of the Book of Mormon. This is taken from a letter that a man named Stephen Burnett wrote to Leadfoot Lyman E. Johnson. Now, Burnett was an early convert in Kirtland and had been a faithful Joe follower for over half a decade by the time that he wrote this letter describing just a remarkable scene. This is taken from the LDS archives in an 1839 letter book, where the letter was copied and reprinted. Quote, I have reflected long and deliberately upon the history of this church, and weighed the evidence for and against it, loath to give it up. But when I came to hear Martin Harris state in public that he never saw the plates with his natural eyes, only in vision or imagination, neither Oliver nor David, and also that the 8 witnesses never saw them, and hesitated to sign that instrument for that reason, but were persuaded to do it, the last pedestal gave way. In my view, our foundations were sapped. The entire superstructure fell in a heap of ruins. I, therefore, 3 weeks since in the stone chapel, gave a full history of the church since I became acquainted with it, the false preaching and prophesying of Joseph, together with the reasons why I took the course which I was resolved to do, and renounced the Book of Mormon, with the whole scene of lying and deception practiced by Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon in this church, believing, as I verily do, that it is all a wicked deception palmed upon us unawares. Martin Harris arose and said he was sorry for any man who rejected the Book of Mormon, for he knew it was true. He said he had hefted the plates repeatedly in a box with only a tablecloth or handkerchief over them. But he never saw them, only as he saw a city through a mountain, and said that he should never have told that the testimony of the 8 was false if it had not been picked out of him, but he should have let it pass as it was. End quote. And I'm afraid that's it. Not So Smarty Marty publicly denounced the testimonies of the 8 and the 3 witnesses, testimonies that had been included in every single Book of Mormon since the beginning of its publication in 1830. He said that he only saw the plates the way a person sees a city through a mountain, and that his natural eyes never beheld the plates, that he only hefted them while covered and saw them in vision or imagination. This is the guy that funded the fucking Book of Mormon. If not for Not So Smarty Marty being somehow convinced that the Book of Mormon is true, we wouldn't have the damn thing. Joseph Smith would be a nobody in American history. And just like that, after all Marty's shenanigans and reckless credulity, which enabled Joe to fuck him over so many times, he exits our historical timeline. Marty has a very fulfilling life after this. He leaves behind the Church of Christ in Kirtland to live in a Shaker community for a while. Then he joins up with some other churches, and then eventually moves out to Utah in the late 1860s, and then dies there. But this was the final straw for Marty following Joseph Smith. Joe and Marty wouldn't share correspondence or even be in the same city together from this point forward. In June of 1841, Not So Smarty Marty was quoted in the Painesville Telegraph with saying, "I believe that the work in its commencement was a genuine work of the Lord, but that Smith, having become worldly and proud, has been forsaken of the Lord, and has become a knave and impostor. I expect that the work will yet be revived through other instrumentalities." End quote. Harris's name may come up in the future of our historical narrative before Joe dies in 1844, but really, this is it. Not So Smarty Marty finally had enough, and now we must bid him adieu and Godspeed for his trials and tribulations that face him in the future. Thanks for being such a barrel of laughs, Martin Harris. So let's go ahead and finish out the short historical timeline for this week's episode so we can get into a conversation that I had with one of the greatest new podcasters out there. Back in October, after Joe had gone through the whole Grandison Newell PR debacle, another court was held against Joe and Rigdon in absentia, from which a guilty verdict came down and they were fined $1,000 each for illegal banking practices. Now, we may sit back and say, well, everybody wanted a piece of Joe and Rigdon by this point, so what was so special about this court ruling that fined him $1,000 each? Well, Grandison Newell had filed this lawsuit, and it was separate from the one claiming that Joe had tried to have him killed, and people were owed this $2,000 in damages. We'll talk about the fallout of this court ruling and the fairly rash decisions made by Joe and others to answer the fallout in the next episode. But for now, let's just find out what happened for the rest of December 1837 and close out this year and officially open up 1838. This time of utter chaos in the Mormon historical timeline is moving on. We're steaming on forth. Joe had arrived back in Kirtland from Missouri on December 10th. Now, the last passage that we read out of the history of the church was taken from the end of November. So this is, a couple weeks after that, December 10th, once Joe had arrived back to headquarters. Once he got back, he found that the church, which he left teetering on a knife edge at the end of September, was now just lying in a pile of chaos and ruin with absolutely no rhyme or reason to it. People wanted Joe either usurped or dead. Really anything but what he was doing before. Kirtland was no longer safe for the prophet. So Joe, Rigdon, and a few other trusted individuals left Kirtland. Permanently this time. Joe and Rigdon fled quickly with their families to make their way back to Far West, where Joe and Rigdon had just reestablished the church hierarchy out there to be filled with trusted individuals with serving as Joe's eyes and ears while he's gone. This is a passage taken from the manuscript history of Brigham Young. It's hosted on boap.org, the Book of Abraham Project.org, and be sure to check the show notes for a link to this. Quote, "On the morning of December 22nd, I left Kirtland in consequence of the fury of the mob and the spirit that prevailed in the apostates who threatened to destroy me, because I would proclaim, publicly and privately, that I knew by the power of the Holy Ghost that Joseph Smith was a prophet of the Most High God, and had not transgressed and fallen as apostates declared. On reaching Dublin, Indiana, I found my brother Lorenzo and Isaac Decker, and a number of other families who stopped for the winter. Meanwhile, the prophet Joseph, brothers Sidney Rigdon and George W. Robinson came along. They had fled from Kirtland because of the mobocratic spirit prevailing in the bosoms of the apostates. Here, the prophet made inquiry concerning a job at cutting cordwood and sawing logs, after which he came to me and said, 'Brother Brigham, I am destitute of means to pursue my journey, and as you are one of my 12 apostles who hold the keys of the kingdom in all the world, I believe I shall throw myself upon you and look to you for counsel in this case.' At first, I could hardly believe Joseph was in earnest, but on his assuring me he was, I said, 'If you will take my counsel, it will be that you rest yourself and be assured, Brother Joseph, you shall have plenty of money to pursue your journey.' There was a brother named Tomlinson living in this place who had previously asked my counsel about selling his tavern stand. I told him if he would do right and obey counsel, he should have opportunity to sell soon, and the first offer he would get would be the best. A few days afterwards, Brother Tomlinson informed me he had an offer for his place. I asked him what offer he had. He replied he was offered $500 in money, a team, and $250 in store goods. I told him that was the hand of the Lord to deliver the President Joseph Smith from his present necessity. My promise to Joseph was soon verified. Brother Tomlinson sold his property and gave the prophet $300, which enabled him comfortably to proceed on his journey." End quote. That was one nice little fuck you from Joe right there, right? I mean, the fuck you was carried out by Bloody Brigham, but as always, Joe was the one that was in desperate need of money, so it was kind of a fuck you by transitive property. But to sum up the passage as a whole, Bloody Brigham's life was at stake. He was one of the most ardent supporters of Joe, and once Joe and Rigdon left Kirtland, it was no longer safe for Brigham to be there. This fearless movie villain mold that I've created for Bloody Brigham, and that he fits perfectly into up to this point, was shaken to his very core for fear of his life, and he had to run away from Kirtland. That's how polarizing Joe was, and how cancerous support of him could be by this point. People hated Joe so much by this point that they were threatening the lives of not only him, but also of his closest supporters. People have to be really mad at a person if they're driven to a point that they might kill somebody just for supporting the person they're mad at. That is a whole new level. The move from Kirtland to Far West was an ugly and arduous one. We'll read more from the manuscript history of Brigham Young next historical episode to narrate the journey for us, but needless to say, they weren't moving the 800 plus miles through Ohio and Illinois and Missouri in the winter with moving vans. We're talking covered wagons. And the shit these people dealt with was some hardcore frontier shit around which none of us could even begin to scarcely wrap our minds. On January 12th, barely a month after arriving back in Kirtland, Joe gave a revelation to the church and left for Missouri at 10 o'clock at night to avoid detection. This is that revelation taken from the History of the Church, Volume 3, page 1. Quote, "Thus saith the Lord, Let the presidency of my church take their families as soon as it is practicable, and the door is open for them to move unto the west, as fast as the way is made plain before their faces, and let their hearts be comforted, for I will be with them." End quote. Then he fucking ran. Lickety split, as fast as the prophet has ever left any city before. Joe and Emma gathered their things and they left. And that's when they met Bloody Brigham in Dublin, Indiana, completely destitute of property and money. And the scene that we read just a second ago played out from the manuscript history of Brigham Young. Remarkable. I had the opportunity to speak with a couple of missionaries this week. I was down at the local university campus to do a couple of studies and to use their library. And whilst sitting in the main square reading The Rise of Mormonism, two missionaries walked by. I couldn't believe it at first. I fumble-fucked my book back into my bag, and then I chased him down only after I had to pinch myself just to be sure that I was awake. We discussed many things during our 45-minute conversation, but one thing we did talk about was anti-Mormons in history. Now, I told them a story about Brother Snyder taking 200 books of Mormon in the English mission and then burning them, to which they agreed was a very anti-Mormon action to take. But when we discussed that last episode, or whenever we talked about Snyder, I was more interested in knowing some details about Brother Snyder. When did he go on his mission? Who did he talk to? Who was his companion? Why did he leave? Did somebody make him angry, or did he realize the truth? Why did he feel the need to burn 200 books of Mormon before he left? Countless questions circulate through my mind about this guy, and I want to know more. But alas, he was labeled as an anti-Mormon, and his story will likely never be told. And that's probably one of the more frustrating things with the historical records surrounding the Mormon religion, is this one-sided nature of things. We can read anti-Mormon literature written by people like Grandison Newell or Eber Howe. We can read the sanitized version of Mormon history from many sources, especially from the history of the church. But we don't get much closer to understanding the people behind the history. People are always people, and they don't generally do things unless they have a good reason to do them. Snyder probably felt like he had a good reason to burn those 200 books, or else he probably wouldn't have done it. That leads us to a question. When we research the history of the church during this tumultuous period of strife and unrest, we often tend to lose the human element in things, and just look at everything with a pro-Joseph or an anti-Joe lens. Now, all of those people that left the church and started their own churches had good reasons to do so. Not so smarty Marty probably had a good reason in his mind to stand up in the middle of the church and declare that he never actually saw the gold plates right before he went and joined up with Smalling and Co. to start their own church. Ollie had his good reasons for leaving the church in the spring of 1838. We get a small insight into why during his letter exchanges at the time, but the question is, what's missing? There's truly no way we can know the shit these people were dealing with and the motivation behind their reasoning, but they probably had good reasons to do whatever they did. And that's probably one of the main takeaways from my conversation with the memories. What's missing from the historical record that can never be replaced with journal entries or court documents? To put it simply, it's the human element. When researching these individuals, it's easy to put a nickname or a person's printed name into a situation and then try and speculate as to why things went the way that they did. But it's even easier to lose sight of the fact that these were real people dealing with real-world frustrations and feelings about the prophet and their own eternal salvation. I said a couple of episodes back that this 1837 and 38 defection crisis affected everyone. Every single person in the church, regardless of their position or whether they are a leadership or just a typical member, every single person was affected somehow by this fracturing of leadership. The everyday non-leader member of the church was suddenly faced with a decision that had eternal implications. Now, I want you to just picture yourself there. You've been following Joseph Smith for the past 5, 6, 7 years, since you read the Book of Mormon and you had a burning in your bosom that told you that it was the Lord's truth. Then finally rumors arise that the prophet's been fucking a teenager and fucking investors in the Kirtland Safety Society Company, and then, of course, fucking anybody that stands in his way, like Grandison Newell. A bunch of trusted leaders of the church, people that are your friends, are suddenly considered heretics and begin to break off and make their own churches, each with varying degrees of faith in the Book of Mormon and Joe's revelations. Then Joe comes up with a revelation that you have to leave everything you have behind for the second time since you joined the church. This is like Colesville and Fayette all over again. You have to move to Missouri, where Mormons are being dragged out into the streets and beat to death or shot after being chased out of their homes and their families run into the wilderness. What the fuck do you do? An even bigger question than that, which must have played into these people's decision-making, what does God want me to do? Which of these people are true prophets, and which group will lead me to heaven in the afterlife? It's not just about homes, businesses, friends, or family. This is a question that has eternal ramifications on your everlasting soul. So I ask again, what the fuck do you do in this situation? And there really isn't an easy answer to that question. And we're looking back on this from 180 years in the future. We aren't the people that actually dealt with this and had to make these hard decisions. I admire the people that went through this and made the decisions they made. They had no idea that the whole thing was just a load of bullshit. And they'd be much better off just joining a local Methodist sect or something. That's just a luxury that we have with the power of hindsight. This was eternal life or death to these people. We can never lose sight of that aspect in our historical analysis. The human element. These were fellow human beings going through this, not just names in a book or nicknames on a podcast. But speaking of podcasts, I'm excited to introduce the guest of this episode, a fellow podcaster that's been taking the community by storm. If you're just as interested in Mormonism as I am, you're just as fascinated with the church canon as I am. That means that you may or may not have studied the Book of Mormon, as well as the Pearl of Great Price, and maybe even into the Doctrine and Covenants that can get very repetitive at times. Well, I'm currently the co-host of a podcast that reads the Doctrine and Covenants. Now, many of you that listen to this show do listen to my Book of Mormon podcast, but there might be 1 or 2 listeners out there that aren't aware of it, so I'm bringing on my co-host of that show in order to talk about that show, as well as the kind of work that we're engaging on. So, Marie, welcome to the show.
Well, hello, Bryce. And hi, everyone. I am Marie Kent, the host of My Book of Mormon podcast.
After you having me on your podcast, ever since you took over for David Michael, I feel like you are long overdue coming onto my show and, kind of talking about the show, what it is that we do, and just, getting the listeners reintroduced to the My Book of Mormon podcast. So do you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself? If, listeners have no idea who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself, Marie.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I'm a nerd, first and foremost. So this podcast that you and I are now doing, we're reading through all of the religious texts that Mormonism has. It was started originally by David Michael, and he was also a nerd, very similar to me. He decided that he wanted to learn about Mormonism, and he thought the best way to do that would be to read, say, the Book of Mormon. So he did that and learned a lot. Yeah, you'd think it would be a great way to learn, but actually, perhaps not so much. Yeah.
Well, he learned how to speak Mormonese, but that's about it.
Yes. Yeah. And so what happened is he finished the Book of Mormon, and then he went on to the Pearl of Great Price. And even after that, he went on to the Book of Abraham, and then he was still going, and he was doing the Doctrines and Covenants. And that's when you and David started reading the Doctrines and Covenants together.
Yes.
And
we had been hanging out before, we had attended a couple of Reason Con before, and we'd hung out before, and I went onto his show early on. I went on to My Book of Mormon when I first started my show. It was like the first bump in listenership I ever saw was from the My Book of Mormon podcast. This listening audience, thank you all. So
awesome.
He and I have been friends, and he just kind of wanted help going through the Doctrine and Covenants more than anything because it's so fucking boring. God,
oh my gosh.
It's insane,
so dry.
Right?
Oh man. Yeah, so then now your listeners are wondering, what am I doing here? So I believe it was in May or June of 2016. It's been like 5 months and I've already forgotten the exact time frame. And he got a big promotion at work. So he put a little blurb out on the podcast saying, hey, I can't do this anymore. Does anyone want the show? And I have been a listener from nearly the beginning. I binge listened to it as much as I could. And so I'd heard your podcast. And so I was listening to both. So at the time I was current on both podcasts. And so I'm sitting at work and all of a sudden, my favorite podcast host is saying, my favorite podcast isn't going to exist anymore. And I'm like, no. So I basically just dropped what I was doing and I emailed him and I was like, can I have your show? And he said, sure. I wish I wish I could expand on it more than that, but that is literally what happened. Yep. So you and I chatted on the phone for a bit and we're like, hey, let's give it a shot. And so I've been doing it since June with you. And I've just recently started reading some of these chapters with some other ex-Mormons. And we are literally just reading the text. And I don't know what any of this is because I was raised Baptist and I have since left Christianity. So I know a lot of Baptist theology and interpretation of scriptures, but I knew nothing of Mormonism at all other than, yeah, they're kind of Christian, right? With a shrug. Yeah.
Well, and you're just through listening to My Book of Mormon and listening to Naked Mormonism, you're gaining this clinical understanding of Mormons.
Yeah.
But never interacting with ex-Mormons and stuff like that. Not like engaging in the culture and stuff like that too.
Oh goodness, no. I don't know any Mormons at all, and not because I just try not to associate with them, but because I live in the Midwest and I literally don't know any Mormons. There are Mormons here because I looked it up on the internet, and there is a church that's a couple miles from my house, so apparently there are Mormons. But I just don't know anything. But I am having so much fun because I see everything through this lens of what it means to be Baptist. So then when I'm reading this incredibly dry text, and it's like the administrative text readings from Joseph trying to solve things when they're, oh my goodness. I read it and I see it as a historical thing, which I find fascinating. So it's almost like this podcast, it started originally as David was trying to figure out what Mormonism was. And just from the nature of having read through everything, and the Doctrines and Covenants is very historical, because each one starts with the day and the time. So it's almost turning into a religious history podcast, sort of.
Definitely.
I don't know. We're just following where it goes, and that's sort of where it's going.
And it's so much, like you said, it's so much fun, right? Because, I have to share this because I haven't told anybody about this just yet. But earlier today, I was up at the campus, up at University of Washington campus, and I was hanging out up there to participate in a couple of studies. And they had there were a couple of missionaries that walked by just on the campus. Ooh. They evangelized there all the time, apparently. So, of course, I see him and I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm so excited to see him. So I gather all my things and I go talk to him. And, we talked for about 45 minutes and it was a fantastic conversation. I absolutely loved it. But at one point they said, how is your Book of Mormon studying going? And I said, well,
and you're like, it's going great.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I said, I've recently I've read through the Book of Mormon, listened to it on audio tape, with commentary, and I've kind of moved on from the Book of Mormon. I did 7.5 hours of podcasting about it. I feel like I understand it. So I've moved on to the Pearl of Great Price and now the Doctrine and Covenants. And I said, have you guys read? I asked them, I said, have you read the Doctrine and Covenants? And they said, oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm like, isn't it boring? They both kind of chuckled a little bit. They're really fun to talk to. But
cool.
We talked just about the Doctrine and Covenants and how it's just, there's the typical Jesus-y stuff, I'm the Lord thy God, behold, verily, verily, and all that fun stuff, triple drinks.
Oh my goodness, yes. Have you explained the drinking game?
No, I didn't. I didn't talk about that at all.
We're going to pause this and we're going to talk about the drinking game.
Let's talk about that.
This is the best part of our show, that it is so boring. I mean, that part's not the best part. Sorry, I said that really poorly. Back up. So, as you're reading through any of this, you notice that certain words just keep on happening. Like, behold, verily, yea, and so it came to pass. Like, those are phrases that happen all the time.
Yes.
All the time. So what we're doing is every time one of those happens, you take a drink, which is particularly hilarious because when David Michael started it, he was drinking beer, and we all know that beer, and we all know that Mormons do not drink beer. So when I was just a listener and that would happen, I'm a long distance runner, and so I would just take a drink of water, and it worked great because I was perfectly hydrated on my long runs. Because I tell you what, you get to mile 15 and you forget to do anything like drink water because everything hurts. So it was a great reminder. So we have continued that tradition, and I love it. So drinking game, everyone.
And it's not necessarily alcoholic beverages, if that's not necessarily your cup of tea. I mean, we're open to all drinks. Just, that's just a matter of just taking a second and appreciating the drink word, the beholder, the verily, verily. So. If you ever decide to listen to my podcast and decide to become a supporter over at patreon.com/mybookofmormon, My Book of Mormon podcast, sorry, one of the reward levels is you can actually get drink coasters, like for, say, beer, and it has those keywords on them. Which That's amazing.
They're on order right now, so I can't provide them right now, but in a couple weeks they're going to start going out to patrons.
There you go. Very nice.
I know. So we are all about the equal opportunity drinking on this show, but as long as there is drinking.
Yes, and your furniture is protected with the handy-dandy coaster.
I'm here for you and your furniture.
There you go. So, I mean, the Doctrine and Covenants really is boring unless you read it through a historical narrative. And that's kind of the point of why we're doing it, why we're reading it through this way, and why the show is so much more fun to do than just reading through the Doctrine and Covenants. Because you can't really talk, you can't make jokes about all the same stuff that's just repeated over and over. But when you're actually like examining the historical situation that necessitated such revelation, then it starts to make sense. The pieces come together, and it's pretty fascinating to read it that way. Yeah. And I just have to say, as far as podcasting goes, you've definitely picked up the My Book of Mormon podcast mantle and taken it to new levels. I mean,
Thank you.
You're having a bunch of people on to just talk about this, about what this is, about, help read along. We had Joel on for a previous episode that we'll talk about soon. We'll talk about Joel Kuhn here in a second. But, you're doing a fantastic job on the podcast, and I think the listeners are really enjoying it. So, if people listen to this show that don't listen to My Book of Mormon podcast, that's where you can get, kind of our banter back and forth and our discussion of the historical narrative as it's played out in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I've recently started doing, super recently, as in, like, say, an episode ago, I went to Fort Collins to tour a temple.
Yeah, tell about that.
Yes. Oh my goodness. We're going to talk about that on my show too. So everyone come over to my show, listen to it. Because obviously I had never been in a temple because, again, not Mormon, but I have this extremely clinical understanding of Mormonism in general. Mm-hmm. And a wonderful listener let me know that since even though I can't go into a temple not being a Mormon, the public can go into temples after they're finished construction before they're dedicated. So I called up one of my friends and was like, hey, Chad, want to go tour a Mormon temple in Colorado? And he's like, why
what?
Wouldn't I? Oh, he was such a good sport. And so I recorded the entire tour and I posted it up as an episode. And you get to hear me miss incredibly obvious things, because I'm just going to take a wild guess that a lot of your listeners are ex-Mormons or are currently true-believing Mormons or have some connection to Mormonism. A wild conjecture, but I'm guessing that's fair.
Yeah, it's fairly accurate.
Yeah. So somehow I had missed that the temple isn't just a more fancy version of a church. It wasn't until I was literally in the temple and I had walked into the baptismal font area, and then I'd gone into another area that I realized that it wasn't like a cathedral. It was a building just for these specific rituals. Like, how did I miss that? But it's because I've been listening to the text for 2 years, and nobody'd mentioned that there's a church building for the day-to-day and the weekly stuff, but then the temple is just for special ceremonies.
Yes. It's completely separate.
Missed it.
Stuff, yeah.
Completely
like closed
missed it.
door stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is part of what makes this podcast so much fun, is that I missed the super obvious things if you grew up in the Mormon church.
Well, and it's kind of fun to have that child's perspective of it. I'm not saying that in any sort of derogatory term, but to have that just completely elementary understanding and saying, I don't know anything about this. I want to learn as much as possible, and actually interacting with fellow Mormons, because I'm going to bet that 9 out of the 10 people, or probably 9.5 out of the 10 people that were around you at that
super
open house,
Mormon.
Super Mormon, right? I mean, there are probably very few that are not Mormon, and they're probably just the people that weren't Mormon there were just dragged there by their fellow Mormon, family member or whatever. So
I would totally believe that.
But I mean, it's like this whole culture to kind of like peek in on and learn about.
Yeah, and I'm having so much fun. But to make a slight transition here, one of the reasons why I'm having so much fun is because of Joel, as you previously mentioned, made this amazing website that we currently use on my podcast that is going to be part of your, should I say, literature? No, scholarship?
Yes, something like that. Sure. So, well transitioned. Wow, you are a fantastic
I'm a professional
podcaster. My God, right? Yeah, it's amazing.
I know. I've been doing this for like 4/5 months. I can do anything.
You know what's going on. Yep. So Joel Kuhn, he created this Doctrine and Covenants comparative, where you can see versions of the Doctrine and Covenants in front of you. You can look at the 2013 or the 1833 version, the 1835 version, and you can see them side by side and see the differences highlighted. It's amazing.
It's a thing of beauty.
It is absolutely fantastic. And yes, we are going to incorporate it into the realbookofmormon.org Kickstarter campaign, into the website, as part of the Book of Mormon comparative. We're going to kind of turn this into an entire comparative of all Mormon canon to other canon. Eventually, we're going to get to like the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible and that as well. So
it's great.
It's just, canon comparison, basically. And that's what Joel did. And the guy was great. I mean, we had him on for My Book of Mormon. He's just a gem of a dude. Just a great, great guy. And just did this on a weekend, just got a wild hair and just went for it.
Yeah, so what amazes me is how simple it is. So I assume you have show notes, and there will be a link to this in the show notes.
Yes.
Otherwise, go over to joelakuhn.com/dc-compare, and don't worry, go to the website, go to this show's notes, and you'll see it. And you pull it up, and there's just a drop-down box at the top, and you can choose what chapter it is. And then down below, it just populates with 2 different versions that you can select. So you can have side by side, like right now I have 2013 on the left and 1844 on the right. And the differences are highlighted, but it's not just a matter of highlighting, because anybody can highlight, but what this does is really easily show you where massive things have changed.
Yes.
Because the Doctrines and Covenants is, quote unquote, a living document. So it has been revised over the years. And if you look on the LDS official websites, it just says that there have been adjustments. And then it's pretty vague on what those adjustments are, except it says, well, there's some revisions to some headers, and the headers have been adjusted for historical context, which is true. It's absolutely true. But what they are not saying is that some of these chapters are completely changed. Like, in our modern day, if we want to just revise something, we'll just cut a paragraph here or throw it somewhere else, or we'll just adjust a few words, or, and nobody really thinks about it. But this is like serious revisions that sometimes fundamentally alter what it's saying.
Absolutely.
And it's right there. Oh my gosh.
One of the more recent ones that we went through was when it was talking about the saints that were moving into Kirtland after they made their first mass exodus from New York, and they moved into Kirtland and Mentor, Ohio area. and they began to try and practice at the very basic of it, a law of, a common law, basically a communism system where everybody gives their possessions to the church, to the bishop, which was Newell K. Whitney, and then he divvies up resources as he sees fit. Well, when we look at the 1833 version, it's very clear, like, these people coming in are basically refugees. They have nothing. We have to sustain them. We have to give them, out of our own stocks so they can survive out here. But when we read the 2013 version, there are wildly different changes in
they were
the
talking
wording
about
of it.
adultery or something.
Yeah, they added this little chunk about adultery, but when it came to, like, the actual communistic stuff, it more just changed it into this, like, give to the needy type of idea. It wasn't this, like, demanding iron-fisted communism.
Yeah, instead of you have to give them everything, it's give what you are able according to what works for you. Which is a very, very different way of looking at it. But all they did was they changed a couple words, but they never, the church never announced that they were changing a couple words.
It just happened.
It just happened like magic. So if you're reading something today and all you can see is just the one version, you just think, well, this is how it's always been. Actually, as we were discovering on my podcast, so different. Not everything is completely different, but there are enough changes that it is worth noting and it is worth studying.
Yeah, and putting into an entertaining audible podcast format as well. So
that's the goal.
Exactly. So, Joel put together this website, and we're going to incorporate it into the into the Real Book of Mormon Research Hub, because this information does need to get out there. And, having that available to where you can talk to believing Mormons, and you can pull up on your phone a little mobile version of the Doctrine and Covenants, and it shows the 2013 version, and it shows the original 1833 version. And you can talk about the differences in it. You can show them right there on your phone where there's been a difference or a problem. Like, this is an invaluable resource, and having audio part entertainment it makes it even better. Yeah,
and Joel is the nicest guy you will ever meet.
He is.
Yeah, because he came on and it was wonderful, because he is not a Mormon either. He's a lot like me. He was raised Christian, and he was just kind of fascinated by religion, as a lot of people are. And so he did just do this on a whim, but I told him ahead of time which chapter we were going to read, and he'd done his research, and he was just prepared and ready to go, and so kind. So this work that he has done, I am proud to spread the word about it. Because we're not just supporting the sharing of knowledge, we're supporting this man who was a very nice man.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So that being said, Joel, thank you very much for creating this.
Thank you so much, Joel.
Yep. Oh, I think we've said that many a time in many an episode, but it just needs to be said.
And I'm going to do it
again. Right? Exactly. So and that kind of gets us to, the My Book of Mormon podcast and how it's evolved and changed up to this point. You've had on, like you said, a couple of people to help you read a section. I believe the episodes that are going up this Sunday, they're one of those as well, right?
Yeah, so this Sunday is the episode that you and I recorded with Joel, and then the episode after that, a listener, his name is Jim, and he happened to be local to where I am, and so he messaged me, and he came over to my house, and we did an episode, recorded it in my kitchen.
Awesome.
And so he used to be a Mormon, and he no longer is, but he still had his old Doctrines and Covenants that was old, that he studied from when he was younger, and so he showed me where he'd marked it up for things that he had studied in seminary, and we read it, and it was great. So I do have pretty much an open call on my show to if you are a true believing Mormon, and you're able and willing and interested in doing a podcast, message me, comments at mybookofmormonpodcast.com, and we'll see what we can work out.
There you go. Very nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I would say like 95% of the other host is Bryce.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, because you're so good, and I'm having fun doing it with you.
Well, and I actually have to say, we did have a little bit of I don't know how to say it, like an interview process sort of with a couple of people when David first decided to go off of the show. And we were working with a couple of people that were possibilities, and your name came up, and I was like, let's just see where this one can possibly go. And I'm sure that anybody that we would have selected would have been great, but I just have to say I'm having a lot of fun with you as the co-host. You definitely contribute a lot to the show and make it. It's just so much fun to come onto that show, to come onto your show, and just to work with you through this Doctrine and Covenants. I really, really enjoy our banter back and forth.
Yeah. So anyone who's considering listening, trust me, we do make it fun. But it is still the Doctrines and Covenants through and through.
Right. Yeah, as unbelievable as it is to have the Doctrine and Covenants be fun, it's possible, I swear. But speaking of that, we have a couple of episodes to record of that show, so I think I'm gonna sign off on this episode. But Marie, thank you for finally coming onto the show and sharing with everybody here. If they didn't know what My Book of Mormon podcast is, they know now. So thank you so much.
Of course, thank you, and thank you, listeners.
And that is it for the historical portion, as well as just a quick interview section for this episode. Normally, I try and keep those two things separate on this podcast. We have the historical narrative episodes and then the special edition episodes with conversations. But this was apropos and a convenient way to transition into a discussion about the Kickstarter campaign and the state in which it currently sits. So there have been a few new people that have pledged to back the campaign. We have Joel, Julie, Zach, and Larry. And I wanted to thank everybody there that's listed for pledging those dollar amounts to help further this Kickstarter campaign. Now, I do have to say, the Kickstarter campaign has quite a bit to go. There's a bit more funding to get before it reaches its timeline in 10 daes from when this airs. I'm optimistic, but also realistic about it. So we're going to keep persisting and see how it goes, and then do a wrap up of the progress and the success of the campaign next episode, hopefully. That being said, I did just want to make everybody aware of something that's coming up next week from when this episode airs. Of course, if you're listening to this in the backlogs, it probably doesn't help too much. But on Friday, October 21st, 2016, at Turner Hall in Milwaukee, there is a Myth Information Conference. Basically what it is a huge pinnacle debate between Robert Price and Bart Ehrman talking about the historicity of Jesus. In case you don't follow the realm of, Jesus historicity and historical studies, Robert Price is on the forefront of minimalist scholars who think that Jesus was basically just a fictional story, more or less. But Bart Ehrman is on the forefront of scholarship that posits that, of course, Jesus was a historical person, or else we wouldn't have the writings that we have about him. So it's going to be a really fascinating debate. These two people are at the forefront of their fields in researching these topics. And of course, there are plenty of other talkers. There's Thomas Smith, Rob Moore, Dan Barker, Matt Dillahunty is also the moderator. I mean, there's a bunch of people that are going to be there. It's going to be this, 8-hour conference from 1 to 9 p.m. And then there's going to be an after party as well. Well, just a heads up, I'm headed out there to Mythicist Milwaukee next week, and we're all going to hang out and have a good time and watch this debate and hang out at the after party as well. Marie is going to be there. Joel Kuhn, who makes the DNC comparison website that we talked about during that interview, is going to be there. David Michael, the old host of the My Book of Mormon podcast, will be there. There's a bunch of other podcasters that'll be there. We're all going to be hanging out, having a good time at the Aloft Hotel in Milwaukee. Starting at about 9 o'clock at night. That's when the after party begins. That's where we're all going to be hanging out. So if you happen to be going, or if you're interested in going, tickets are still available, and I would love to see some listeners there. I'd love to hang out with some of you, talk with you, and maybe we'll grab a beer while we're there at the hotel bar. But anyway, just want to make everybody well aware of that as it's happening. It's going to be great. I mean, I've never been to Milwaukee before. I don't know if, I know Wisconsin doesn't necessarily have the highest reputation of having anything more than cheese, But I'm curious to see what Milwaukee is like, especially this time of year, and see this amazing debate between two scholars that are at the forefront of their fields of study. So yeah, this looks to be quite a fascinating debate. They teased this debate happening a couple of years ago. I mean, I think I remember hearing rumors of this going on a couple of years back. Been looking forward to Robert Price and Bart Ehrman debate for so long. Now it's finally happening. I'm super stoked about it. So yeah, hopefully people listening to this in the backlog will not be too bothered by this. But if you're listening and you're caught up and listening as the episodes come out, and you happen to be in the Milwaukee area, or you're actually going to this conference, I would definitely love to meet you and see you in person and actually talk to you face to face. That being said, that is everything for this episode. First, we'll start off by thanking Demonista, who runs the Facebook page. Thank you so much for putting up things on there that people can see. More Mormon shit, way more than what I talk about. Also want to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork for this show as well as the daughter podcast. You can check out his blog at weirdmormonshit.com. Need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music that's used in the show with his permission. For his music, you can go to aloststateofmind.com. I'd like to thank everybody that is supporting the Kickstarter project, the Real Book of Mormon Research Hub. We're making headway with that, and it's constantly evolving. We're super stoked about the project. Also want to thank anybody that rates the show on iTunes or your podcasting app of choice. And then thank you so much, all of the patrons who support the show through patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Most of all, above everything else, I want to thank you, amazing listeners, for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.